If you understand how to identify and calculate your intervals using the method explained today, then you're in good shape. And so Unit 5, it covers generic intervals, interval quality, and then Chapter 21 and 22, those are the two main ways to identify intervals. And then Chapter 3 talks about the difference between simple and compound intervals, which very simply is any interval that's less than an octave is simple. Any interval that is larger than an octave is compound. So the first thing we're going to talk about are generic intervals. These are important because they tell you the general distance between two notes on a staff system. They don't tell you whether or not the interval you're looking at is major, minor, augmented, diminished, or perfect, but they do tell you generally whether or not an interval is a fourth apart, a third apart, a second apart. This is a very easy concept, so it shouldn't take you long to learn this, but we need to learn how to identify generic intervals before we can go on to identify the chromatic intervals. So let's just do a quick review here. An interval is the distance between two notes. The distance between a combination of three notes would not be an interval, that's actually a chord. When you have three or more notes that sound together or melodically, those are usually classified as chords. So the generic interval only provides you with the numerical distance between the notes. So that means that if I ask for the generic interval between C, let's say C4 and G4, the answer would be a fifth, because you've got C, D, E, F, G. That's 5 notes. The distance on the staff is 5 notes. So that's all the generic interval tells you. It's also a quick way of identifying an interval by its relationship to other notes on the staff. So if I'm a conductor and I see a series of thirds in the score, it may be a combination of major and minor thirds, but if I'm just talking to my orchestra, I can simply say, play those thirds more quietly, more piano. Numbers are used to identify intervals with the exception of the unison and octave. And what that means is if you have a unison, it's still going to be the number 1. You're still going to write P1 for perfect unison. But we don't call it a perfect 1 or a perfect first. We don't call it a perfect 8 or a perfect 8th. We call it a perfect unison or a perfect octave. That's all that's trying to tell you right there. And we're going to get into that. I'm going to remind you of that again when I talk specifically about how to calculate your perfect intervals. But for now, let's concentrate on the generic. So here you can see that the distance from C4 to G4, just happens to be the example I gave you, is a fifth apart. And you do that by simply counting every single note in between the lowest and the highest note in the interval. That's all you have to do. Just count the number of notes. So if you have C4 to E4, it would be a third, because C, D, E. That's 3 notes. C4 to B4 would be a seventh, because you've got 7 notes in there between the C and the B. C, D, E, F, G, A, B. Okay, so generic intervals are, as I said, a very useful way to just quickly identify these notes on the staff system. So in the first line there, that's labeled fifths, each one of those intervals is a perfect fifth, well, except for the 4th measure. But generically, they are all fifths. So if I'm a conductor or a musician, I'm talking about, those 4 fifths in the first couple measures, you know exactly what I'm referring to. In the next line, you have a bunch of seconds. Notice how each one of those notes is a second away from each other. So you got your G and your A in the first measure, that's a second apart. A and B is also a second. So then in the final one, you've got your sevenths. Notice how they're always the same distance apart. And that's one of the things that if you get better at this, you'll start to be able to just recognize these intervals by looking at them without actually having to count the letter names. When they're written on the staff, you'll notice that a fifth always skips either a space or a line in between the bottom and the top note. If you look at your F and your C, it skips the A. Your G and your D, it skips the B. With your sevenths, it always skips 2 lines or 2 spaces. So in your first example, from the F to the E, notice that it skips the A and the C. In the next one, it skips the B and the D. So that's one way to quickly identify intervals when they're written on the staff, at least generically. It doesn't tell you the quality of the interval, but at least you'll know the numerical distance, or what we can call the generic interval. One thing which should be pretty clear, but I'm going to go ahead and say this to be extra clear. When it comes to accidentals, they don't come into play when identifying whether a note is a fourth or a fifth or any other interval for that matter. With generic intervals, the only thing that matters is the general distance between the 2 notes on the staff. So if I have a G flat and a D quadruple sharp, it's still some type of a fifth. Doesn't matter how many accidentals or lack of accidentals there are. All that matters with a generic interval is the distance between the 2 notes, the numerical distance. Okay, so that brings us to the interval quality. When you have a fifth, it doesn't tell you whether it's perfect, augmented, or diminished. If I simply tell you that there's a fifth in that music, you don't know what kind of fifth it is, which means that you don't know what that fifth sounds like. So one of the ways that we identify the exact quality is by adding terms that identify the actual quality of the note. So that's what this chapter is going to detail. And this is one of the more complicated chapters. A lot of students do get confused, so make sure you read along in your textbook too if you still have any questions. So the interval quality simply tells the musician what kind of interval you're dealing with. It doesn't tell you the distance between the 2 notes. It tells you the quality of the note. So major intervals will sound different than minor intervals. That's basically what it's telling you. So there are 5 interval qualities that you could have: perfect, major, minor, augmented, or diminished. You'll notice in parentheses you have a single letter. These letters are abbreviations for each one of those qualities. So if you have a perfect interval, instead of writing out perfect, if you had to write this for an assignment, you would just write P followed by the number 1, if it was a perfect unison. If it was a perfect fourth, you'd write P4. For major intervals, what's really important is that the M, if you're writing it out by hand, is easily identifiable as a capitalized letter. So one way to do that is to make sure that the tops of your M are very pointy, and make sure that the M is the same size as the number. So major third would be M3, major sixth would be M6. The minor abbreviation should be half the size of the number, and the edges of the M should be very rounded. That's important because what happens, and it won't be so important in this class because you're doing this online, but what happens with a lot of musicians is they'll write a minor third and they'll use the abbreviation, and the M will be as big as the 3. And while if the corners are rounded, you might assume it's a minor third, you don't really know. So it's important to make those M's half the size of the M, half the size of the uppercase M, and half the size of the number. You need to make a distinction. So augmented intervals are just an A. You have A4, A5, for example, and you need to make sure that is an uppercase A. For diminished intervals, lowercase d. Again, with the minor and the diminished, they're lowercase, to add another layer of distinction from the other perfect major and augmented intervals. So diminished means you're taking it down a little bit. Minor also means you're taking it down a little bit from the major. So we use a lowercase symbol to indicate that. When it comes to perfect intervals, you can only have a perfect interval on a unison, fourth, fifth, or octave. You can't have a perfect second, a perfect third, a perfect sixth, a perfect seventh, a perfect tenth. You can't have any of those intervals, okay? So only use the perfect interval quality on the unison, fourth, fifth, and the octave. As I mentioned, a perfect interval is written with an uppercase P followed by the interval, the numerical distance. So in the case of a perfect fifth, you just write P5. A perfect fourth, P4. And remember that P has to be capitalized. With major intervals, these occur when an interval falls within the major scale. Now, by within the major scale, I'm referring to the distance between the tonic, the first scale degree, and every other scale degree in that scale. So the distance from the first scale degree to the second scale degree is a major second. The distance from the first scale degree to the third scale degree is a major third. From the first to the fourth scale degree is a perfect fourth. From 1 to 5 is a perfect fifth. From 1 to 6 is a major sixth. From 1 to 7 is a major 7. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but for now, all your major and perfect intervals occur within the major scale in relation to the first note of that scale. So a C major scale, C to G, they're 5 notes apart, so that's a perfect fifth. So we're going to get into more of that when we actually talk about how to calculate chromatic intervals in just a moment here. So remember, the major interval must be written with an uppercase M followed by the numerical interval value. With minor intervals, they are a half step lower than their related major intervals. So a minor second is simply 1/2 step lower than a major second. So that's one way to figure out these intervals. So with minor intervals, they can be minor seconds, minor thirds, minor sixths, or minor sevenths. And we'd abbreviate that with a lowercase m followed by the number. Same as a major, except you're using a lowercase m instead of an uppercase m. So for your diminished intervals, they can be formed in 2 different ways. You can either have there's 2 different ways. When you have a perfect interval that's lowered by a half step, any perfect interval that's lowered by a half step becomes diminished. If a perfect interval gets lowered by 2 half steps, it's a double diminished interval. You're not going to see any of those in your assignments. When a minor interval is lowered by 1/2 step, that's also a diminished interval. So the unique thing about perfect intervals is when you lower them, they don't become major, they don't become minor. A perfect interval, or a fifth, or a fourth, a unison, or an octave, these intervals can never become anything other than diminished or augmented. They will never become, you'll never have a minor fifth, you'll never have a major fifth. Those are perfect intervals, augmented or diminished. That's all you can have with the first, fourth, fifth, or octave. So diminished intervals can occur on any generic interval, including perfect intervals, which means you could have a diminished second, you could have a diminished fifth, you could have a diminished seventh, whatever you want. Well, whatever is written in the score, it could be diminished. So this applies to all 12 intervals that we have available to us. So remember, the diminished interval is written with a lowercase d followed by the interval. For augmented intervals, you can also form those in 2 ways. Same as with the diminished, a perfect interval, when it's raised, becomes augmented. A perfect interval, can never become anything other than augmented or diminished. Just keep that in mind. A major interval is raised by a half step. It also becomes augmented. So if I had a major second from C to D, because that's in the scale or in the key signature of C major, C to D, if I make it C to D sharp, that is an augmented interval all of a sudden. So now it's an augmented second because I raise that D one half step. Augmented intervals can occur on any generic interval, just like their diminished counterparts. And an augmented interval is written with an uppercase A followed by the interval name. So A2 or A4 or A5, A6, whatever the interval, the numerical interval it is, you have to raise that and by a half step and use the augmented abbreviation for that, which is just an uppercase A. I'm going to show you how to identify intervals using the major scale. This system works really well when the bottom note of an interval fits one of the major scales that exists in our our circle of fifths, which consists of perfect fifths from C all the way around, right? So I'm going to show you how to do that. It doesn't work so well when the lower note doesn't fit the circle of fifths. So for instance, a C double sharp, a D double sharp, there is no C double sharp key signature, there is no D double sharp key signature. Those are considered theoretical keys. We don't use them because C double sharp, it'd be better to write that as D major since C double sharp and D are the same note. E double sharp, we wouldn't do that either. So this works for the majority of intervals, but I'm also going to show you how to figure out some of your theoretical intervals if you come across them using the major scale method. I think the simplest way to teach the concept of chromatic intervals is to use a major scale. The simplest way to identify them is probably the chromatic system, which we're going to get to on Thursday. So to figure out your intervals using the major scale, all you have to do is find the major scale that corresponds to the lowest note in the interval. So if I have, going back to my first interval I gave you, C4 to G4, C4 is the lowest note. So what you would do is figure out the key of C major. Well, the key of C major has no sharps and no flats. So that means that any interval above a C would have to use no sharps and no flats for it to be major. So since the G4 above C4 doesn't use any flats or sharps, it fits the key of C major, that makes it what we could consider a major interval, but remember we don't call them major, we call them perfect. So that makes it a perfect fifth because it fits it the key of C. So what you do is you find your major scale that corresponds to the lowest note in the interval. Then you count the number of notes from the lowest to highest note in the interval. Like let's use this scale below. We've got E, let's do E to G sharp. Let's say that's your interval, E4 to G sharp 4. So what I do is I count E, F sharp, G sharp. Okay, E to G sharp is some type of third. Now what I have to do is figure out if E to G sharp works in the key of E major. And we're using the key of E major because the bottom note is an E. So you have to figure out the key signature for the bottom note in the interval. So in the key of E major, you have 4 sharps, which means that the F sharp, the G sharp, the C sharp, and the D sharp should all have sharps attached to them. So since I'm trying to figure out the distance between E and G sharp, I need to know if that G sharp fits in the key of E major. Well, it just so happens that it does. As you can see by looking at this scale here, the third scale degree is a G sharp. Now, if the third scale degree was a G double sharp with a little X instead of a pound sign, then it would be an augmented third. If it was a G natural, that's a half step lower than the G sharp, that would be a minor third. If it were a G flat, which is 2 half steps lower than the third scale degree found in E major, it would be a diminished interval. So using the major scale, you can figure out what the interval is based on its relationship to the notes that exist in the major scale. But remember, you have to use the bottom note has to be the tonic of the scale. And then you have to find the top note within that scale and see if it matches the major scale. So what happens when it doesn't fit the major scale? So let's say you have a question, what is the distance between C double sharp and D sharp? And remember, the double sharp sign is indicated by the X. The sharp sign, it's not really a pound sign, but it looks a lot like it. The actual sharp symbol is straight up and down, where as you can see with text, I just use a pound sign to make it easier. But a pound sign actually slants a little to the right. So they are different symbols, but you know what it means if you see that D sharp there. So in order to figure out the difference between C double sharp and D sharp, you have to start with a C sharp major scale. So in the key of C sharp, you go to your circle of fifths, you find out how many sharps are there. There are 7. So every single note in the key of C sharp has to use a sharp. So I go ahead and I write out my C sharp major scale, or I pull up my complete major scales. It's located in your textbook. I find C sharp major, and then I raise every note in that scale a half step, because my bottom note's C double sharp, so I need a C double sharp bottom. So this creates my theoretical C sharp major scale. Now I can figure out whether or not D sharp is in the key of C sharp, our theoretical key. So we go from C sharp to D, and it just happens to be a D double sharp. Well, that's not a D sharp. D sharp is actually a half step lower than that D double sharp, which means this is a minor second, because in order for this to be a major second, it would have to be C double sharp to D double sharp. So that's how you figure out your intervals. You simply find the major scale. If there isn't a major scale that corresponds to the lowest note in the interval, then you take the scale that's closest to the lowest note in the interval, and you raise everything in that scale, the major scale, by a half step, or you lower it by a half step. You do whatever you have to do to get that bottom note.